Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast and Mormon Matters podcast. This is a joint release of Mormon Stories and Mormon Matters, and I could not be more excited today to be here to talk about this interesting and important book published by Greg Koford Books, edited by Blair G. Van Dyke and Loyd Ericson, called Perspectives on Mormon Theology, Apologetics. That's going to be the main topic today. I'm joined by Dan Witherspoon. Hey, Dan.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, glad to do this series. I'm really excited to continue our discussion.
Yeah, it's good to have you. It is October 26th, and we also have joining us today, again, the author of an important chapter in this book, but also the co-editor, Loyd Ericson. Loyd, welcome back to Mormon Stories podcast.
Hello, hello.
You were on very early to Mormon Stories, weren't you?
Oh, yeah. That was a long time ago.
Hey, well, tell us more about yourself, Loyd. Besides your work with Koford Books, your background and stuff, I'd love to hear about.
My background is I went to Utah Valley University, got a degree in philosophy with a minor in religious studies, and that's where I really became interested and began with participating in Mormon studies. And then I went out to Claremont Graduate University to pursue a degree in religious studies there, which is Dan's alma mater. And yeah, that's my background. And then as I was working there, studying there, I started working at Koford Books and eventually kind of started running the show there.
Good.
So happy to have you here, Loyd. And then also we're joined by Bert Fuller. Bert, why don't you introduce yourself for a second?
Hi, thank you for having me on. I did my undergraduate degree at BYU in English with a minor in editing, during which time I worked for the Religious Studies Center. That's the publishing house for religious education for the religious faculty. I also worked for the Maxwell Institute under CPART, the Center for the Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts. Worked closely with Christian Heal and Carl Griffin there for 2.5 years. I did my master's at BYU in comparative literature, and I'm currently enrolled in a PhD program in medieval studies at the University of Toronto, which I'm finishing remotely while I live in Utah County, and I'm also a recently licensed real estate agent.
Woohoo.
All right.
In other words, something to make the money that the rest of us don't make with our degree.
It's great to have you here, Bert. You're a super thoughtful and interesting voice, and I'm really happy to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, we're glad to introduce you. I think a lot of people who are listening know a bit about Loyd, but Bert, you're a fascinating guy, and I've enjoyed our relationship and excited to have you make your debut.
Thank you very much.
So before we jump into the actual discussion, there are always a few announcements that we need to make, and so I'll make at least one or two, and I'll try and keep it super brief. Mormon Stories has just launched a Patreon account, and give me just a second to explain what that's about. So it turns out that less than 1% of Mormon Stories listeners donate. And because we're a 501c3 nonprofit and we pay Dan and Gina and we have a staff, we rely on the generous donations of those who enjoy what we do. And so Patreon's a way for people to donate in small amounts as we release episodes. Sam Harris and lots of other podcasters are using Patreon as a way to encourage people to make small donations. And so we've implemented Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Mormon Stories, you can sign up there. And basically the way it's set up right now is for every interview that we do, you just pay $1. We try and do between 4 and 8 interviews a month. So the least you'll pay a month is probably 4, and the most you'll probably pay a month is 8, and you'll only pay as we release interviews. So we just want to encourage people that if they value what we do, to please sign up either through Patreon or to go to the mormonstories.org page, click on the PayPal button at the top right. You can sign up for 10 or 25 or $100 a month, whatever you can afford. And you can be assured that that money goes to a 501c3 nonprofit that's transparent and that uses your donations for the mission, which is to support people experiencing or impacted by a faith transition. So that's our plea. We also really appreciate it if you follow us on Instagram or on Twitter at Mormon Stories. Please like us on our Facebook page, Mormon Stories Podcast. And we also love positive reviews either on Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook page or on iTunes. And then finally, we have a workshop tomorrow on navigating a Mormon crisis of faith. It's in Utah County. It's all day from 9 to 5, again, October 27th. You can go to mormonstories.org/events to register. We also have a half-day workshop November 17th in Utah County, and we're coming to the Bay Area November 9th and 10th, again, for a Mormon Stories workshop. So any of those events you can sign up for at mormonstories.org/events. Dan, do you have any announcements from the Mormon Matters point of view? And I think you're muted. I unmuted you.
No,
Go ahead, Dan.
there, you got me. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, other than I hope I get a Patreon account too.
Yeah.
It's all news to me. So as a potential beneficiary of that would be wonderful. But
yeah,
so,
we're testing with Mormon Stories. Then we'll get you set up, and
Sounds
Gina soon after.
Yeah, no, that would be wonderful. We just had a retreat. So I think that's the big thing. We the 13th through the 15th, we had a fantastic group. There was so much shared and really mind-bogglingly powerful moments there, including during our very final session, a husband and wife sharing with us that coming into the retreat, they were like 99% likely that they were going to divorce. And that starting with the Friday night, which is just introduction and sharing your stories and everybody being so open about where they are, they were able to begin to have conversations as they would drive back and forth about an hour to the retreat. And then the same thing happened Friday afterwards. And then by Saturday, they let us all know. We didn't really know that they were struggling that much. We knew about the big differences in faith, but they both said they're 100% committed to making their marriage work. So, I mean, it's worth it. And thank you so much to all the donors who donated scholarship monies. We had a great response this time, and people, I'd say about 6 to 7 of our couples or individuals were beneficiaries of that. And it was wonderful.
Or do you guys have something planned in the future, Dan? Or
nothing this year. So definitely we want to do about 3 retreats, and we're going to do some one-day workshops next year as well. So
excellent. All right. One more quick thing about Patreon. The way that Patreon's set up is you can kind of give your Patreon subscribers some benefits. And what we're going to do is we're going to be releasing our podcast interviews 2 days early for Patreon subscribers, and also for existing donors who donate through PayPal or DonorBox. And what we're going to do is we're planning on creating a secret Facebook page just for donors. And that can be a way that we disseminate some of this stuff early. So for example, we interviewed Mike Noah, Mike Norton, and we interviewed Michael Quinn recently. And what we're going to do is we'll be releasing those interviews early to donors, either through a secret Facebook page or through Patreon, before we release it to the general public. So I just wanted to add that that's kind of a little bonus that we give our donors, just to kind of thank them for their support. So, all right. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. For those who don't know or didn't tune into our first discussion, just about a week or two ago, we had a really fascinating discussion to kick off this series on what we're calling Mormon Apologetics or NeoApologetics. And we had Patrick Mason and Brian Bert on. If you haven't listened to that episode, we've gotten really wonderful feedback about it. And just to sort of recant a bit, what basically Brian and Patrick did is they sort of retold the history of Mormon apologetics. They talked about 19th century apologetics briefly, but then we talked about B.H. Roberts and then Hugh Nibley. And then we talked about the creation of farms that included, the work of Jack Welch and the stuff with Chiasmus and the work of Hugh Nibley, but also Daniel Peterson and Lou Midgley and all the different things going on at BYU to sort of defend faith and Mormonism from that standpoint. Then we talked about maybe there were some critiques about traditional approaches to Mormon apologetics. And we had talked about how how farms morphed into the Maxwell Institute, and then it's just sort of how all that's played out. And then finally, we talked about how today there's sort of a new brand of apologetics led by people like Richard Bushman, Terrell and Fiona Givens, Patrick Mason, and others that basically tries to take a softer, gentler approach to apologetics, not relying on ad hominem attacks, not trying to make unfounded scientific claims that stretch the bounds of science in ways that don't make sense, that's more pastoral in nature, more willing to acknowledge the problems, but also still very much encouraging and defending faith. And Loyd, you made some interesting posts on Facebook about how you had concerns, or you were intrigued by the idea that on this podcast, not only have you been sort of a critic of some forms of apologetics in the past, but that also maybe you anticipated being put in the position of having to defend apologetics. And so what I thought we could start with is sort of your reaction to part one of this series. Talk about what you agreed with or didn't agree with, or how you saw or see, Hugh Nibley and Daniel Peterson and Farms and the Maxwell Institute, and just so that we can know exactly where you stand historically with apologetics, so that you're not put in the position of being mischaracterized in any way. Is that an okay place to start?
Which points I want to hit. Right, now am I unmuted? All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can go ahead and touch that. There's a few thoughts, and I'm just thinking about in the last few minutes of ways I might want to respond. And one of the first ones is when we talk about apologetics, we're usually talking about a bunch of dudes engaging in, we have multiple metaphors about measuring and whatnot, but really just a bunch of guys, and usually like the elites, right? Scholars, church leaders and whatnot, engaging in apologetics. And ended up being one of my favorite chapters in our book was a chapter by Julian Reynolds. And what she highlights is how much of apologetics isn't being done by these scholars and these men, but are ordinary Latter-day Saints who, back in the days of America Online, are going on to groups about Christianity and noticing that Mormonism is being bashed all the time and attacked. And so what that chapter really reminded me of is how much of an act of love apologetics is for so many Latter-day Saints, that it's not about going out there and punching and kicking and bruising and trying to win fights and arguments. It's really about, for so many, it's just an act of love of people going in and trying to defend something they care deeply about. And I think that's something we often, and I've completely missed out on when discussing apologetics, is looking at how ordinary Latter-day Saints are often engaged in it in ways that we really don't think about. So there's that point. And I guess the other, critique I would offer is when we're talking about old style apologetics and neo-apologetics, I think we're creating too much of a dividing line, right? And ultimately what I would say is that both of these groups, I would say, frame it, and I think Joe Spencer framed it this way a few weeks ago at a meeting, is he called it evidence-based apologetics. All right, and so in terms of evidence-based apologetics, right, that's what Farms is engaged in. I would say that's the exact same thing that Richard Bushman and Terrell Givens especially are engaged in. And so in that sense, it's still the old style apologetics, just with, as you point out, kind of a different tone, right? And examining evidence differently than previous groups had in the past. But what you do see kind of emerging, these are things that like Joe Spencer and perhaps Adam Miller and others are articulating, is an apologetics that's not evidence-based, that is more trying to defend the faith through spiritually, right? And when I say intellectually, in a sense of making it Mormonism interesting rather than trying to appeal to evidence. And I would say that could be called a neo-apologetics, though I'm not sure that under how I define apologetics, I would categorize that as apologetics. Hope that makes sense.
Sure. Just to touch on sort of references you may have made about being critical of apologetics in the past, do you want to make a brief either affirmation or disagreement with sort of how we characterized, farms and fair and even the Maxwell Institute in our last episode? Do you agree? Do you disagree with the critiques?
I largely agree. I think tone is a big issue. And I think whether or not people are making good scholarly arguments is a good critique. However, I would add that I think we get too drowned out in those discussions, rather than asking whether or not apologetics, even in general, even if it's utilizing the best scholarship whatsoever, and even if it's got the kindest, most charitable, loving tone possible, whether that's even something worth engaging in. And my personal belief in my argument, in my chapter is no, like that's it. Apologetics all around is problematic.
Okay, well, let's dig in. Dan, do you want to lead Loyd through a discussion of his chapter?
Yes, I would. I was intrigued for a second there, Loyd, when you talked about evidence-based apologetics and maybe the neos and the classical ones doing the same thing. And again, this is, you and I were in philosophy of religion and theology. So do you consider anything evidence? Do you consider anybody's own change of heart, anybody's own awakening to something higher or what feels to them profound, something that moves them, something that gets them off their chair and gives them more orientation in the world? Do you consider that as at least a form of evidence for them? I mean, it was sort of let out of that discussion, but I always want to at least make sure we remember that as an evidence.
So I guess as I would qualify evidence, it would be evidence that could be discussed publicly in a scholarly
we all have
way,
access
right?
to it,
yeah, something that everybody has access to.
Right.
Yeah. So what I would call spiritual evidence, I would say that's the sort of thing we ought to be, if you want to call that apologetics.
Yeah, right.
But I would say that
Good.
Isn't actually apologetics then.
Yeah. Hey, well, take us into your chapter. I'll let you know when I got to this chapter 12 of yours, this was like the hallelujah chapter for me, because it basically says things that I've been trying to say for 5-6 years, but you said them nicer and more articulate.
Thanks.
And just a little bit language here, but would you take us through the argument about how there's a confusion in just the very act of doing apologetics that I think a lot of people on both sides, both the critics of the religion and the defenders of the religion, don't really quite notice?
Yeah, so my argument, I'm heavily influenced by a philosopher by the name of D.C. Phillips, who Dan.
Yeah, who you studied.
I was hoping to study with at Claremont. He actually passed away right before I got there.
He died then. Yes, yeah.
But I've been heavily influenced by his writings, and also just found like this philosophical brother there and theological brother, and so one thing that Phillips does, and he is a student of Wittgenstein, is he talks about there's certain there's certain conceptual languages, there's way we talk about things that have their own kind of rules and can be applied certain ways. And what I argue is that with apologetics, and how I'm going to define apologetics is I define religious apologetics rather strictly, which some may disagree with, but I say it's using secular, public argumentation to defend or prove religious claims. And by religious claims, I refer to things that are spiritual in nature. And so what I argue in my chapter is that apologetics, this attempt to use secular argumentation, to use history, to use archaeology, anthropology, language, philosophy, anything like that, to defend or prove a religious claim, is trying to weave two different categories of things into one, and is ultimately doing something they can't do. And then in doing so, this works both ways, right? It works on the apologist trying to use history to defend the church, as well as a critic trying to use history or archaeology to criticize the church. And when I say the church, meaning religious claims. And so I guess a basic example is something like the Book of Mormon, right? When apologists want to say the Book of Mormon is true, they're usually saying, okay, here's some historical or archaeological evidence, therefore the Book of Mormon is the word of God. And I want to say that jump from one to the other simply can't be made. Yeah. But you could say, here's historical and archaeological evidence that the Book of Mormon is historical, and perhaps some scholar can come out and actually prove, hey, this text is historical, but it cannot prove that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, right? You only know the Word of God is Word of God if by reading it you feel moved, like you feel God working within you as you read the text.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful way to do it, especially the idea that a scholarly claim can't affect a truth claim.
That's right.
Like the historicity or something like that. Anybody else want to jump in at this moment? Otherwise, I'll take Loyd through a couple more examples from his piece.
I mean, I definitely, Bert, I think you may as well. I definitely want to discuss that, but what I want to give Loyd a chance to do is lay out kind of his main arguments in the book, because I feel like once we start talking about it, we could just start really getting into it and not giving him a chance to kind of lay out his core arguments. Does that make sense?
Well, that's pretty much the core argument. Is really just
it's one argument that articulated
that there are secular claims that can be proven or disproven, right? In secular claims, it'd be historicity, whether or not something happened in history, right? There's secular claims, and then there's religious claims, and religious claims is a claim about God's involvement in these sorts of things. And secular claims can be proven or disproven using secular history, secular archaeology, secular studies, scholarship, whereas religious claims are such a thing that can't be proven or disproven using those things, but are rather proven or disproven through religious tests. Your own heart, as Alma says, you test it out, and does it make your heart swell? Right? Does it move you? How does it taste? Right? And taste is a great example because, right, taste is something, it's very subjective and yet is very real at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I like that metaphor of taste because it is something that is grounded, right? It's not something like something's going to taste good no matter what. Like, no, it either tastes good or it tastes bad, but it's hard to to argue about taste with someone else who might have different tastes.
Yeah, there's an important piece of your article essay that also is a piece of confusion that we'll often get, and that's when somebody who's a defender of the church or truth claims goes and says, well, through my study, I see that this Joseph Smith is a trustworthy person. I see the goodness, etc. Therefore, though I realize that I'm not, a lot of people don't actually do that, though I realize this doesn't really affect whether or not the Book of Mormon was, made up or, channeled or whatever it would be, or was ancient. It helps me. And so I think there's a lot of critics especially will say, well, if I can go after the character of Joseph Smith negatively, that will affect the truth claims of what emerged from him too. So it's a confusion that
so that's a good point, and that's something, I guess that's actually one of the key points of my arguments that I felt to address, and that's the point that by engaging in apologetics, apologists are connecting secular claims to religious claims. They're saying that the secular has something to say about the religious, and once by doing that, they are telling the critics, yes, it is correct that you can prove or disprove religious claims. And so where I see a lot of faith crises happening, to an extent, I think most faith crises actually happen because of spiritual things. But, when people look at certain histories of Joseph Smith, their arguments about the historicity of the Book of Mormon and whatnot, they end up buying into what I would call this false criterion that the secular has something to say about the religious. And so apologetics, by making their arguments, are saying, yes, these two things are connected, which then enable critics to draw on that same connection to critique religious claims.
Yeah, I got to read one line because it's got the great word from D.C. Phillips in it, from page 212 of your thing. By joining or establishing the assumption that these religious claims can be proven or defended by scholarly means, they are creating or adding to the fantasy, as Phillips calls it, that religious claims can be disproven and attacked by the very same means. And so I love that fun language from D.C. Phillips, who was an amazing guy. Everybody, yeah. I got to know him there for my last year or so that I was there, and he was just so warm and wonderful, but also brilliant. And it was a great loss.
And yeah, because Phillips was critiquing Christian apologists in this, from what I'm quoting from, and And a lot of these Christian apologists could not stand Phillips because he's basically telling them, hey, yeah, like you think you're defending Christianity, but you're really just playing this game that feeds in to the critics rather than actually engaging Christianity and religiosity for what it truly is.
So, there's a line you have in your book where you said his primary contention, as he explains in his preface, is that apologetics is guilty of friendly fire when it says more than it knows. And I'm saying that because I like this term of friendly fire. Can you talk, Loyd, about examples of when Mormon apologists, maybe give some specific examples of when Mormon apologists have maybe actually done more harm than good by engaging in what you call friendly fire? Just to put meat on the bones of that.
Yeah, I would basically say I think a great example is the Book of Mormon Central. I got lots of great friends out there who are working with the Book of Mormon Central. But they just released a book, and it was based upon a bunch of posts they've been doing, and like 101 pieces of evidence or something that the Book of Mormon is true. And I think that is a perfect example, because what they're doing is, when Mormon, by saying the Book of Mormon is true, they're not talking about historicity. They're talking about, is this thing the Word of God? And you see that claim being made over and over again, right? So because of, here's evidence about, this possible place called Nahum in the Middle East, therefore the Book of Mormon is true, right? And they could appeal to lots of other things that same way. And so by doing that, by the way, that's my dog barking out there. You can hear that.
Bert already took out his dogs.
She's in heat right now, and it's a big mess. But literally a mess. But anyways, and so just the title of that book itself, I think, leads into that problem, because it's tying the truthfulness, right? The Book of Mormon being the Word of God, to these 101 so-called evidences or something that they articulate in this book.
And so if those evidences fall, they've done harm, because somebody, at least them, as well as somebody who really believed it. My mom was really big on how the origin of the word Rameumptom meant something from two different languages that meant tall tower or something. It's like, oh, brother.
And so like a personal, to really ground it, like a personal example, I remember before my mission, driving up to the Sandy City Library and checking out a bunch of books and reading things online. This is very much, this is 1990s, early 1998. So very, dawn of Mormonism on the internet, and reading like a critical argumentation, like, oh my gosh, Mormonism is false. And then I find something written by Farms or something, and like, oh good, Mormonism is true again, thank goodness. And then I read a critique of that response. I'm like, oh great, Mormonism is false again. Yeah. And bouncing back and forth between these historical, archaeological arguments going back and forth, and that completely don't even discuss whether or not, what I came to finally realize has no bearing on whether or not the Book of Mormon is inspired or, from God, or has the power of God within it.
Yeah. Now, Loyd, do you like the term category mistake? I picked it up from, my studies and things like that. And it's the one that I kind of use when I talk about, I guess in this way, I'm going to say I'm critiquing initially the critics of Mormonism, the ones who are making the attacks, that they're making a category, they're using a category mistake in asking the certain types of questions that can either yield only historical or, evidence-based, as far as hard evidence-based kind of questions of spiritual things. And that, religion and spirituality and things is far more like an art than a science. And so you're kind of asking sciencey, history questions of something that's, more of an experiential, artistic, if you were to take John Ogden's 3, the good, the true, and the beautiful, this would be the beautiful, the personal experience.
Yeah, category mistake or conceptual confusion. Wittgenstein would talk about language games, right? So there's this idea that secular, when you're talking about history, archaeology, that's one particular type of language game, but spirituality uses a different a language game that has its own rules by which it's understood. And now, I think, there's a confusion or mistake by trying to bridge those. I think I think critics do this just as much as apologists. And again, my argument is the apologists simply feed into the critics making that same mistake.
Right. Now, the thing is, it's hard for you to then say, okay, if this is in its own spiritual realm, it's in its own personal experiential realm, how can it be tested? How can there be some sort of sense of whether this is good or bad, or this is somebody dissembling versus somebody who's sharing something authentic? And Ken Wilber is the only person who at least made the biggest impression on me, probably 15, 16, 17 years ago. He wrote a book called The Marriage of Science and Sensibility. I can't remember what it was. The Marriage of something, and it was a science religion kind of thing. And he says, well, within religious communities, he says, especially the Eastern ones, when you have the gurus and sort of the elders and whatnot, they are able to judge because they've had the spiritual experiences themselves, whether or not one of the initiates, one of the up and coming people have sort of got it, through those interviews of the koan and the various different things, they can sort of tell. And I've sort of, in many ways, through my journey, where I've kind of stepped into a spiritual space that feels a little bit more both and, I can kind of hold, the myth and the science together in my mind. I'm able to recognize just by my heart and my feeling, oh, this is a kindred spirit. This is somebody who's had spiritual, similar experiences to me. So I can look across religions or whatnot, or within my own religion, and find people like, oh, this person has mystical experiences because there's clues in their language or whatever it is that, only a mystic could really kind of convey. What do you think about that sort of, there is still a way of checking on spiritual experience?
Yeah, I definitely think there could be, just to play out some philosophers, like just basic John Stuart Mill, when you talk about utilitarianism, right? His point is everybody knows what pleasure is. Nobody's like, hey, we ought to achieve happiness or, do things that create pleasure or happiness. No one's like, what is this pleasure or happiness you speak of? Right? Everybody knows what those are. Now, they might have different ways of experiencing it, but we have ways of talking about it. I mean, this is what testimony meetings largely are in an LDS context, is people get up there and they talk about the ways in which the gospel has blessed their souls, right? You rarely see somebody get up in testimony meeting and talking about the historicity of the Book of Mormon, or, whether or not Joseph Smith had, sex with this person or that person, right? It's Mormonism, like, blesses my soul. I was reading the Book of Mormon. I was struggling with how to deal with a family member, and I was reading the Book of Mormon. I was reading this account, it made me realize, hey, I need to be more charitable. All right. I was depressed, and it brought me joy. And Phillips talks, and I quote Phillips about this, where Phillips says, look, there are ways in which religion can be affirmed or defeated, right? It's where it in ways that touches their souls. And so people have their own, whether it be moral or other kind of ways in which they understand spirituality that can be discussed and can be transferred. I think it's kind of fitting in our book that the last chapter by Seth Payne ends with him discussing how he's left Mormonism. He resigned his membership from the church, and he was pretty public about it when it happened. So, it was over the November policy. And for him, it was just like, hey, here's something that just crushed his soul. Like, it just tasted sour to him. And that was something where it was because it just felt wrong to him. Right, is this spiritual gut feeling that caused him to resign his membership. And so I think, we feel things, and we know how to express those feelings. So.
And you can, kind of check beyond yourself. I have one more question, because I don't want to spend the whole thing. I think you've made your argument really well. And I guess it's not a question, but a classic example, and this may upset John and Bert. I don't know how much you've read or how much you've, seen the damage, whether it's damage or whether it's enlightenment is a question. But something like the CES letter, which is just, one after another, factual things, or, does this really add up, or this stuff and things, but it's all in that area of, stuff that naive church leaders, naive church members, sort of the typical narrative sort of affirms he's questioning this in that letter. And it has completely, knocked the socks off lots of people. They share it. And it's the category mistake, or it's this conflation of what one's doing versus the other. Does the CES letter feel like a classic example of what you're sort of saying? This is on the critic end, not the apologist end, but of confusing those two.
It's definitely doing that, and it was funny is like, I'm realizing there's a lot of elitism tied into this, right? So a lot of times us religious studies types will look at the CES letter and just kind of laugh at it, like, this is ha ha ha, right? This person is making all these silly mistakes. And I have to remind myself that the reason I'm able to look at the CES letter that way is because of my religious studies, liberal arts background. I'm able to recognize here, there's this, right, conceptual confusion, this category mistake occurring. But the CES letter only works because there's a long history of not just apologists, but the church making that same category mistake. And so it
the general conference.
It basically set up the rules and affirmed the rules in the CES letter, saying, hey, okay, by these same rules, I'm going to now show that Mormonism isn't true.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge, right? Because there's so much Mormonism, perhaps more than any kind of major religion out there right now, really, in a lot of ways, blends the spiritual and the secular together, right? It's turning secular claims into religious claims. So when you're talking about angels visiting and plates and all these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think what we're learning more and more as we're doing history is that perhaps we've been wrong to blend those so much, right? So when we're talking about witnesses to the plates, we have to remember that the scriptures refer to these witnesses as witnessing the plates with the power of God, or by the power of God, right? So once you're attached by the power of God, we have to recognize, hey, we're talking about something different here, right? And what that difference is, who knows, right? History might be able to help us understand what that means. But as soon as you attach by the power of God to a witness, or translating by the power of God, we have to recognize, hey, we're talking about something different here. And now, because we're talking about something different, we can't pretend it's just a secular thing. And the church is trying to make it a secular thing, and critics and apologists are all trying to say, here, this is a secular thing that we can prove or defend through secular history and whatnot. And they're making that mistake.
Awesome. So I want to turn John and Bert loose on your thesis, if they're willing, and then I do want to spend a little more time about the book as a whole. But I would love it. I think you guys have heard Loyd enough. What are you guys thinking about his argument?
I have thoughts about the CES letter, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
Okay. So it was introduced to me in 2014, just over 3 years ago, while I was working for the Maxwell Institute. I was living in Taylorsville in Salt Lake, and my Elders Quorum president showed it to me, and he said, "Have you seen this?" I said, "No." As I read it, I had the elitist response that Loyd describes. I laughed at most of it, in large part because I'd been reading about a number of these issues since I had my own personal religious born-again experience at age 15. And I started at BYU at 18, served a mission for 2 years, got back to BYU, and I always focused on my study in language and literature, but had a side interest in Mormon studies. And so I was familiar with almost all of the issues brought up in the CES letter. The claim about, I think it was the Captain Cook narratives, and the city of Cumorah, or Moroni, and the island in Africa. I forget the details. That was news to me. I didn't know that. But most everything else was very familiar. And so I emailed Jeremy, and we talked back and forth, and I still have that correspondence for anybody that's curious. And I think Jeremy handled himself very well, and I felt like we had a very civil back and forth. But for me, the point I want to make is that I was familiar with these intellectual problems, and they didn't really affect me. a year ago, I stopped attending the LDS Church, not for any intellectual thing that I learned, but because of an emotional break I had. And so in some ways, I would say that Loyd's thesis is absolutely true. In my own experience, I would say that sharing information will not generate or discredit religious conviction. And I find this to be the case not only in quote unquote religious contexts, but in major secular contexts as well, whether it has to do with politics, with certain scientist ideologies, or with economic theories and so forth. And so that is a brief comment that I'd like to make about the CES letter. On the other hand, okay, I will say from talking to many people who have read the CES letter and had a similar experience to my Elders Quorum president 3 years ago, that experience of reading it made an emotional break for them. And I do not fault Jeremy for putting into one place a lot of problematic issues that need to be confronted that frankly have been poorly addressed either through institutional church channels or apologetics. And when the only difference that I see between me learning these things over time and Jeremy giving it to people in a condensed way is that it distilled on me over a longer period, but even learning it didn't prevent me from the experience of having an emotional break with the church or a spiritual or religious break with the church. And so I do not fault Jeremy. I do not fault others like Grant Palmer or the folks at Mormon Think. I do not fault these people, or even going back, Sandra Tanner, whoever, for collecting this material in a single place, because they have every right to do this. And frankly, Latter-day Saints who want to understand the difficulties in their faith, either because, like Tom Phillips, they want to be more effective missionaries, or like me, they want to be more effective early morning seminary teachers. And you also want to be familiar with the material that's out there so that when your students or potential converts talk to you about it, you'll be prepared to discuss it. And I personally, the point I'm trying to make is I don't find much value in discrediting what Jeremy did or what many others like him have done, when I feel like it's completely their religious right to do so, and it's other people's religious right to respond in the way that they do. So
wonderful. And I hope we didn't come across as saying something other than what you just said there.
Mm-hmm.
We were just, I was only bringing it up as an example of the, a question that's asking something in this language game versus, things that.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, the irony is, to my mind anyway, is that on the one hand, the CES letter will be criticized by folks like Greg Prince and many others for being non-scholarly, for being shoddy in its intellectual arguments. But then on the other hand, it's being accused of conflating the conceptual realms of intellectual discourse and religious experience. So.
Dang.
Well, that plays into a thesis I've been toying with lately, and I hope I don't get myself in trouble by saying this, but the thesis is that religious apologetics, evidence-based apologetics, exists to affirm ecclesiastical authority where prophetic authority doesn't exist or is lacking.
I agree with that so far, as you describe it.
Right, and what I mean by this is, at least in my experience, I haven't met anybody who said, "Hey, I find the church completely just like empowering, it's spiritually fulfilling. I feel like these people are led by God, but I'm going to have to resign because the Book of Mormon isn't historical, or because Joseph Smith wasn't honest with this or that, or something like that," right? It's everybody who leaves, in my experience, leaves, it tied to that is they don't find the church empowering to them. They don't feel prophetic speaking. By prophetic speaking, I'm not talking about like prophesying the future or something like that, but just really hitting on the core social issues, hitting on what they feel is important in the world today. And because they don't feel that, right, I'm not saying they're looking for a reason, but these evidence-based apologetics are what hold them in for a long time, right? So it's like, well, geez, I might not feel inspired necessarily that much by church, but hey, the Book of Mormon's historical, so therefore, like, it has to be the truth, and I need to stick around with it. But once these arguments come in play, and they're like, oh, well, I don't feel the prophetic authority there, and everything that they're trying to base their ecclesiastical authority doesn't seem as strong as they want to make it to be. All right, now I got a reason to go. And so, and you see this, right? Because, this, like Tad Calister's talk, et cetera, right? It's here's the Book of Mormon is historical, therefore it's the word of God, therefore Joseph Smith is a prophet, therefore you need to listen to what we have to tell you. And not because, you should listen to us because you feel inspired by us, because, regardless of the past, you feel motivated, you want to get up out of your seat and change the world. It's because, because evidence, therefore you must obey our authority. And I think, and especially newer generations, millennial generations that are very skeptical of authority in the first place, they see that and they're like, oh, all right, well then I'm out of here. And so the CES letter, I think, taps into that. It says, hey, look, like, all your arguments for why I should follow you have disappeared in my mind, and you haven't offered the prophetic reason for me to follow you. So I'm checking out.
I think that's a fair assessment, as you describe it, and one that was that played a role in my own defection, as it were, because I could find no connection, religious or logical, between my testimony of the Book of Mormon, which I still have, or my testimony of Joseph Smith's prophetic calling, which I still have, or my testimony of priesthood power, which I also have. I could find no connection between these things and the current leadership of the LDS Church. Now, the difficulty here is that when somebody, in my observation, when somebody comes to that crossroads, they oftentimes will take a fundamentalist path on the one hand, or a almost individualist or isolationist path on the other. I have studied fundamentalism somewhat, and determined that would not be a wise decision for me to go in that direction. And so now I find myself on the individualist or isolationist path. And I find other people who have taken this route as well. I find, to use some examples, because we've thrown out names in terms of NeoApologetics or traditional apologetics or so forth. I, for example, find people like Margaret and Paul Toscano among the individualists. I find people like Josh Madsen or Damon Smith among the individualists. Frankly, I find people like Gina Colvin and you, Dan, and you, Loyd, and John. I find you all among the individualists as well, despite remaining active in the LDS Church. And the distinction I would draw is because we come to a point where we make a decision that the general authorities as a collective body are not speaking or acting in a way that we find can be legitimated. And so we express our criticisms publicly. Whereas on the other hand, I found there are one of the distinguishing features of apologists who distance themselves from traditional combative rhetoric, I have found, do not critique these illegitimate uses of authority or abuse. And so when it comes to discussing apologetics and where my concerns lie, it is with the people who will speak to me one-on-one or will talk to groups that are not terribly public, and they will share their feelings. But when it comes to a public forum, such as a podcast or a newspaper or a scholarly publication, they enter more quickly into forms of doublespeak that I feel uncomfortable with.
Super good stuff, Bert. Thank you. John, do you want to weigh in on kind of where we were with Loyd's argument, or should we move on a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll admit that my strength, my background is not philosophical. I do have a PhD, but it's in clinical and counseling psychology, and the emphasis there is literally in sort of coping with the collateral damage of things like a faith crisis once it hits people's personal lives, whether it's causing anxiety or depression or suicidality, whether it's negatively impacting a marriage or relationships within a family. And so I'm just going to admit that as we talk about philosophy, it's not my strong suit. But what I can do is try and maybe talk Loyd through some practical examples and try and probe and understand better the implications of his position. So if it's okay, I'll try and do that. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So, what I'm hearing from you making is something that I first really thought about. Well, I guess Eugene England's article comes to mind, where he did this article called "Why the Church is as True as the Gospel." And as I remember reading that article, what I heard him say was, the church is a great place for you to learn to be a better Christian. And even the weaknesses of the church are good in the sense that they cause us to go deeper, to serve people we wouldn't serve, be with people that we wouldn't normally want to be with. And in that sense, the ward experience becomes a laboratory for developing Christian attributes. So that was my first sort of exposure to what I'm hearing is your argument. And then it extended, when Dr. Dave Christian gave a presentation in New York for Mormon Stories back in 2011, he talked about utility versus validity. He said there are some people who look at Mormonism from the standpoint of validity. And what they mean by that is it true or is it false? And if it's true, then I want to be a part of it. If it's false, I don't want to be a part of it. And that's the validity approach. And then there's the argument of utility, which does it play a good influence in my life? Does it make me a better father, a better husband? And some people don't really care if it's true or not. They just care if it makes them a better person and gives them joy in their life. And if it does, then that's all that matters. And so, Loyd, if I were to summarize what I'm hearing from your argument is, you're basically saying that you can engage with Mormonism sort of in the utility realm, and the validity realm doesn't necessarily need to even matter. Is that a fair summary or not?
I would say no, and here's why. And a big problem comes down to how we talk about, is Mormonism true? And I think a good example of this is Book of the Moroni's Promise, right? And this is, and again, this. And so we've been talking about how secular history can say nothing about religious claims. Well, it works both ways in the sense that religious claims can't say anything about secular claims. And so what's interesting is when missionaries go out and they ask, potential converts, investigators, hey, here's the Book of Mormon. Would you pray about it to find out if it's true? And they read a Moroni's Promise. And usually what that involves is, here, read 35:11. Here, read these 3 verses in Matthew or in Moroni, and now pray and find out if this book is historical, right? But what's interesting, if you look at Moroni's, the so-called Moroni's Promise, and I won't go into the details because I think it's actually he's really just referring to his little sermon he gives in Moroni 10. But even at the heart of it, he says, think upon what the Lord has done to his children throughout history, right? And so what Moroni is saying is, he's saying, think about the ways that God works in the world. And ask, is God still working in this world, right? Is God still touching the hearts of people? Is God still inspiring people? And that's what he's asking, right? He doesn't say pray and find out if this book is historically accurate. He's saying pray and ask if God still works in the hearts of people. right? Is God still there, right? Because it's responding to deism in a lot of ways. And I think, but that confusion happens when then people, because the framework is all put into historicity, right? And these secular truth claims, people, when they talk about Mormonism being true, the Book of Mormon being true, they're talking about the wrong thing. And so I would say that Mormonism, if Mormonism is true, it must have a utility. It must, and a utility in the sense of it, they find it betters their life. And if it doesn't do that, then it's not true, at least to them, right? And people can have different approaches to that, right? So I was talking about, prophetic leadership and not feeling inspired. But my parents will listen to General Conference and they'll feel inspired through every talk, which just does not happen to me at all. Right? I feel quite the opposite, right? And people will feel different ways, but that's really why they stay engaged in it, because it brings meaning to their life. I think very few people would, even like the diehard Mormonism true, would stick around if they felt like it wasn't bettering their lives.